Hey friends, how are you? How's it been? How are things? How's your grandma? Hope she's good. And hey, how are your cortisol levels? Just checking in, you know? It's been a minute. And today, I've got something pretty wild to talk about. We're diving into Severance. Yep. That show that makes you wonder if work-life balance is even a thing. But we're not stopping there. Nope, we're going deeper. We're also going to talk about Stirner's takes on cults, religion, and basically everything that tries to control your mind. And in the end, we've got a book review of Max Stirner and the Political Theology of Fanaticism by Janssen, and it's fresh off the press from 2024. It's got Stirner's ideas mixed with politics and theology, and trust me, it's good. Alright, so grab whatever you're sipping on, get comfy, and let's jump in. So I've had the absolute pleasure of watching one of the better series I've seen in a while, called Severance. Thank you, Asmodeus, by the way. You know why I'm saying that. Wink, wink. Anyway, so as my phone is monitoring everything I do and then force feeding me weird shit, I ended up in somewhat of a rabbit hole regarding the series, which I found fascinating. Because friends, what I found was an absolutely unhinged Reddit post of a person analyzing the living fuck out of it through the lens of none other than Karl Marx. And as I was reading it, by the way, I will share it with you in a second so you can kind of understand what I'm getting at here. But as I was reading it, I was finding myself a bit confused. Because to me, this series is so clearly exemplary of Stirner's philosophy. I would even go so far as to say that it's a critique of Marxism in a sense. But that doesn't seem to be the common consensus. So I guess I want to add my 2 cents here, and I feel that it's also a perfect time to give Marx a little, gut punch for the absolute shit show lowball attack that is his text, Saint Max. So let's go. I will now read you this Reddit post, and guys, this is long, so grab a snack, okay? And let's try to pay attention like the adults that we are. So here it goes. The Redditor says, "For me, the whole show is a metaphor for the fragmentation inherent in capitalist labor systems. The Severance is not just an outstanding plot, it reflects the historical evolution of work. In pre-industrial societies, work was primarily task-based and integrated into daily life. People worked to survive only, completing tasks as needed with their family/community units. There was no separation between one's work self and personal self, as survival and labor were just intertwined at the time. So how did things change? Well, they obviously changed very slowly over tens of thousands of years. But then, the Industrial Revolution brought a fundamental shift. Work became time-based rather than task-based, with people leaving their homes to work in factories. For the first time, people had to adhere to strict schedules rather than completing tasks at their own pace and for their own purpose. This new structure created a clear division between work and personal life, a severance that laid the foundation for the alienation Marx described. Marx outlined 4 key aspects of alienation under capitalism. Alienation from the process of production, from the product, from others, and from one's own humanity. And when you break them down, the severed workers at Lumen, which I will, if you haven't watched the show, I will enlighten you here. The severed workers at Lumen experience all of these. They are alienated from the process of their work, performing mindless tasks like, quote-unquote, refining mysterious numbers without understanding their purpose. They are alienated from the product as they have no knowledge of what their labor contributes to. Social connections are superficial and controlled within the office environment. But most profoundly for me, the severance procedure itself represents alienation from humanity and even themselves. The quote-unquote innies, exist solely to work, devoid of personal history and future, reduced to mere instruments of labor. The innies are alienated from their own full sense of self, their very existence. Severance takes alienation to its extreme. If you were a total nerd, you would even take this a step further and think about how the innies are basically just reduced to a mere tool of production. This is where the person references Marxist commodity fetishism. For Marx, under capitalism, commodities take on a life of their own, obscuring the labor that produced them. In Severance, the innies themselves become commodities, labor power stripped of individuality, existing only to serve corporate interests. And of course, this creates a workforce incapable of rebellion, subverting the Marxist call for workers to unite. Without a shared consciousness or awareness of their exploitation, the innies cannot resist. They represent the ultimate capitalist ideal, a compliant, efficient, and entirely controllable labor force. Okay, so this post is a lot longer and it kind of goes on, and I just want to cut it off here because there's not really any more points made, and I want to speak a little bit too. So let's talk about the premise of Severance for all of you that are sitting here right now thinking, what the fuck, bro? Okay. So the central premise of the show is the severing of personal and work lives, which kind of leads to a split personality dynamic where the work self and the real self are separate. Okay, now you're probably even more confused. So Severance is a psychological thriller series that follows employees of a mysterious company that's called Lumen Industries who have undergone a procedure called severance. And this procedure surgically separates their work and personal lives by kind of erasing all memory of their non-work life during office hours and vice versa. Okay, so the show primarily focuses on a guy named Mark, who's a middle manager at Lumen, who begins to question the ethics of the procedure and the purpose of the company. So as Mark kind of delves deeper, he uncovers very, unsettling truths about the organization and the impact of severance on the employees and the company's darker intentions. So in that, the series kind of explores themes of identity and control and the personal consequences of corporate structures. So it's a haunting exploration, I would say, of memory and autonomy and probably also like the intersection of personal and professional lives. So the idea in this Marxist analysis that I just read to you is that this process of severance, which is highlighted in the series, is kind of a real on-the-nose kind of dramatic representation of the alienation that workers experience in a capitalist system, where their labor is essentially commodified and their identities are reduced to roles or functions within the economy. So Marxist critics, I imagine, would argue that the severance procedure in the show highlights how workers are alienated from their labor and the products that they create and from their very selves, because that's the whole, essence of the Marxist critique of alienation. So this kind of reduces them to, cogs in the machine, stripping away their ability to assert their own autonomy. But friends, we all know this isn't a place where we hail Daddy Marx, okay? This is a place where we deconstruct the fuck out of anything that comes our way. And I'm going to do the same now with this analysis of the series because I don't think it's as nuanced as it wants to be. Kind of like the literal word vomit that Marx put together when he had his panties in a bunch over Stirner's book. And because I think the leading flaw in Marxism is its neglect of the individual, the form that my critique will take is a character analysis of the various characters from Severance and their individual agendas and plots. So let's start with the OG, the first dude that we meet. His name is Mark S, which obviously is a fucking nod to Marx, right? I mean, yeah. So this guy's name is Mark S, and he's the central character in Severance, and he kind of plays like the most like connecting pivotal role in the series. So he's a middle manager at Lumen Industries, which is a company that enforces this controversial severance procedure on its employees. And this procedure basically what it does is it splits their consciousness into two distinct parts, like I said before. So one that experiences work life and another that experiences life outside of work with no memory of each other. So Mark's role in the plot is really multifaceted. At the start, he's a compliant employee. He's seemingly very content with his work and his personal life being kept separate. He even volunteers to undergo the procedure after the death of his wife, so seemingly as a way to cope with the grief and maintain a sense of normalcy. So his work self, which is referred to as his innie, spends his days processing mysterious data for a lumen. Nobody really knows what the fuck it is. While his outie, or the version of himself that exists outside of work, leads a more emotionally distant life. And he's largely disconnected from kind of his past and present. But as the series progresses, Mark starts to question the morality and purpose of the severance procedure. And this happens after uncovering strange cryptic messages and also uncovering unsettling truths about the company's motives. I don't really want to go too much into how he figures it out and everything. So his journey involves grappling with the ethical implications of the procedure and the manipulation of his identity and the secrecy surrounding Lumen. And he becomes increasingly determined to understand the full extent of the severance process, even as it puts him at odds with his company and his colleagues and even his own sense of self. So Mark's plot kind of revolves around his struggle for autonomy and self-awareness and navigates this tension between his divided selves. And it's all about kind of uncovering the secrets of this company, right? So his personal and emotional growth is kind of at the heart of the series and shows the beginning stages of what it's like to question everything that you know. So I want to do a brief analysis here. So at first glance, I would say that Mark seems like a victim of alienation, like the person in the Reddit post was saying. So his dual life kind of appears to represent this epitome of self-alienation, where his character is caught between two worlds. There's the dutiful employee, and then, there's the grieving guy at home where he's still affected by his wife's death. And the show kind of suggests that Mark is not himself at work, right? And that this split is the result of corporate control. But I want to focus on something interesting. So I think that while Mark's journey in Severance might appear to follow the arc of a tragic hero that wakes up to injustice and seeking collective liberation in the way that Marx would envision it, I think that Stirner would suggest something that's far less romantic and way more personal. So the way that I saw it was that Mark's revolutionary awakening isn't motivated by any kind of higher moral cause whatsoever, but by a reassertion of his ownness, right? It's his unique lived experience, his grief, and his desires. So at first, Mark voluntarily undergoes severance, not out of some idealistic belief in the system, but literally just to cope with his grief. And this isn't an act of submission, it's an egoistic act of escape, right? It's a means of avoiding pain and keeping life tolerable. So he gives up a part of himself, not for the company, but for himself, right? So the tragedy is that he doesn't realize how much of his self he has actually handed over. So as the story progresses, Mark doesn't become a revolutionary because of some abstract moral ideal or class consciousness. It's because the severance procedure no longer serves his egoistic needs, right? So it becomes unbearable to him. And the spooks that he once accepted, which is work, duty, institutional trust, all that, it no longer satisfies his desire for coherence, intimacy, and truth. So he begins to fight back, not because it's right or good for the collective, but because it's necessary for him. The boundaries between his innie and outie selves become, suffocating. and they kind of hinder his self-enjoyment. So this becomes especially clear when his innie begins to form bonds with coworkers and he starts yearning for autonomy, right? So the innie isn't motivated by some noble belief in some universal freedom. He just wants to live, right? So he wants to know who he is. And the outie, too, kind of starts to recognize the hollowness of his grief-avoidant life. So he's no longer willing to outsource his suffering and his healing or his identity to this company. So he kind of is done with his grief struggle. And his rebellion then, can't really be called a call to a higher cause, but more like a return to self-ownership. So in Stirnerian terms, this transformation isn't because of alienation or like from alienation to enlightenment, but from unconscious egoism to conscious egoism. So he begins to reclaim what Stirner would call his, quote unquote property. So his body, his memories, his experiences, his desires, and he does so by rejecting the spooks that demand he sacrifice them. So even in his growing concern for others, like his co-workers, this isn't necessarily a break from egoism. So Stirner allows for relationships based on mutual enjoyment, not for abstract moral duty, right? So Mark begins to care because it matters to him, and his concern is grounded in lived connection and not in ethical abstraction. But let's briefly look at the other characters as well. So we have Helly. So Helly is another key character in this series, and her role in the plot is integral to the exploration of the show's themes of identity and control, especially control. So Helly is introduced as a new employee at Lumen Industries, where she has undergone the procedure, recently undergone the procedure. And unlike Mark, Helly's reaction to her severed existence is immediate and intense. So her innie, so the version of herself that exists at work only, is literally completely resistant to the idea of being severed and, really kind of harshly struggles with it. There's a scene where, she goes to the extreme of not wanting something. Okay, so she's horrified to discover that she has no memory of her life outside of work and that she's trapped in this meaningless bureaucratic role. So Helly's journey in the series revolves around her struggle to break free from the control that Lumen holds over her, Lumen the company. So at first she tries to escape. She's desperately trying to get in touch with her outie, and she kind of wants to break the cycle of servitude to the company. And she's just really, really struggling with the oppressive nature of the company and the procedure. But ultimately she kind of gets out of that, and she really kind of wants to, engage in revolutionary action against her situation. So throughout the series, Helly serves as a symbol of the human desire for freedom and individuality and rejecting the boundaries imposed by the external world, in this case, the company. So her plot arc kind of explores, I would say that her plot goes deep into the concept of self-awareness and the tension between the parts of her identity that have been severed. So as her internal rebellion intensifies, she becomes a catalyst for change, right? So I want to analyze this real quick from a Stirnerian perspective. So Helly's character represents the most obvious example of how, someone would rebel against the severance system or the alienation system. So she starts the series by violently rejecting the idea of being severed and tries to escape the system at any cost. So on a surface level, her actions can be interpreted as a critique of alienation or a fight against the dehumanizing forces of the corporate system. But from a Stirnerian perspective, Helly's rebellion isn't selfless at all. It's not for the collective good at all. It's about asserting her own unique self and egoistic desires. So Helly doesn't want to be reduced to a function of the company. She refuses to accept the company's imposed identity, and she insists on maintaining control over her own existence. I mean, it doesn't really get more egoist than that. So Stirner would argue that her rebellion is not about saving others at all. She's actually kind of just using that to get herself out of the situation. So she's acting out of egoism, and she strives for the freedom to live according to her own desires, right? Then we have my absolute favorite character of the show, the boss of all bosses, and the dude who does, in my opinion, the most de-spookification in the whole series. His name is Irving. So Irving works as a senior employee at Lumen Industries, specifically within this macro data refinement department, which is where all these people work, and he processes data just like any other employee in that department. So his role within the company is more like traditional compared to Mark and Helly, because he, at first glance, he seems fully invested in the work and the values of the company, right? So on the surface, Irving appears to be really dedicated and compliant, right? And he fully accepts the severance procedure and the dehumanizing nature of his job. And he carries out his tasks with little resistance and follows the company's protocols without question. But as the series progresses, it becomes evident that his relationship with Lumen and the severance procedure is actually really complicated. So his innie begins to exhibit really strange behaviors, like he has this very deep attachment to the idea of Lumen's leadership and like an almost religion-like devotion to the company's mission at first. But at the same time, he has these moments where he's just kind of falling apart, and this is shown as him like experiencing like this dark liquid just like overcoming his perception, and this is kind of related to his his outer existence. So he's shown to have almost suppressed memories of a past life or of his real life, which includes his former much more complex personality, which kind of starts to surface through subtle hints and interactions. So there's these glimpses of his past which suggests a deeper conflict between the person he once was, or still is essentially, and the corporate person that he's become. And his storyline takes a really kind of dark turn, but it's also like darkly romantic in a sense, because he begins to uncover the sinister nature of Lumen's work and his role within it, because he develops a romantic interest in a person that works there who then gets retired or, basically killed. I mean, this version of him gets killed, and he's very deeply affected by that. So let me give you my analysis of Irving. Irving is by far my favorite character. I love the dude. He's awesome. So he's kind of like a Stirnerian gold mine in a way, because Irving appears like at first to be the most thoroughly spooked character, right? He practically worships this company. He speaks in their slogans. He ritualizes corporate devotion like a loyal priest of capital. But his fervor is precisely what makes his transformation so powerful, right? So for Stirner, a spook loses its power not when we oppose it abstractly, but when we see it as alien to our own will, right? So Irving's turning point begins not in like a grand political awakening, but in this deeply personal and intensely felt connection, right? There's this coworker from another department, his name is Bert, and he's just absolutely like taken by this person. And this love is obviously not spook free, right? It emerges in a setting which is like defined by surveillance and control and repression, but it becomes the wedge that kind of cracks the entire system open for Irving. So Irving doesn't begin to question this company because he suddenly believes in like liberation or justice. He doesn't become political in the moral sense. He becomes political in the Stirnerian sense. So when his love is interrupted, when the structure interferes with his enjoyment, he completely turns. His desire for Bert, for this character, is not prescribed, it's not sanctioned, and is not productive in the eyes of the company. It's literally radically egoistic. It's a bond that gives him pleasure and he's not willing to give that up. So the moment that Bert is removed from his life, this intense desire that he has, he feels that this life that he's living is absolutely, intolerable. So from that point on, Irving's so-called devotion to the system is just done. Like, he's just straight up done. Like, as soon as his desire is, kind of robbed from him, he's completely revolutionary. He's completely radical. And even in the sense of his Audi, the character that lives outside of the company, we see like this obsessive painting that's happening, right? His Audi's like compulsive, haunting artwork, which is not just a symptom of trauma, but also like an act of reclaiming, right? He doesn't really know why he's painting, but it's his fixation. It's like a private ritual of meaning making, right? So for Stirner, this would be a pure egoistic act, or like an expression of his uniqueness that's not reducible to work or duty or morality. So Irving's revolution doesn't erupt because he suddenly becomes a hero or something, right? He doesn't suddenly care about the collective, not at all. He just wants Bert. He wants truth, not because it's right, but because it's his, right? So in this way, Irving does more than just wake up. He actually performs one of the most, I would say, profound acts of despookification in the series. So he reclaims his deepest emotions as his property. So his love isn't sacrifice or duty, it's pure egoistic rebellion. And in loving Bert, he, loves himself too. Not in a narcissistic way, but in a Stirnerian sense of affirming that no system, no ritual, and no ideal is more sacred than what he wants. So on this side of the spectrum, the last person I want to look at is Dylan. So he kind of, I would say, adds like humor and also emotional depth, I think, to the series, especially in terms of his initial acceptance of the severance process and his sort of gradual awakening of its deeper implications. And then in season 2, we kind of get to know more of Dylan and why he's the way he is. But I think I'm just going to focus on the first season. So Dylan works in the same department as Mark, Irving, and Helly, and he performs these monotonous tasks, like all of them. He kind of accepts the severance procedure with almost like a level of pragmatism, I would say. He kind of has fully internalized the separation between his work and his personal self. So his innie is portrayed as somewhat content with the situation, kind of has a sense of humor about everything, even though his work is, shit and annoying. So as the series progresses, Dylan's role kind of expands beyond this compliant employee, just like all of them. So while he initially resists questioning the company or the severance procedure, there's these small moments of rebellion that kind of start happening. So he has these moments of vulnerability where his innie shows signs of emotional conflict, and especially when he's interacting with his colleagues or when his attachment to the status quo starts to crack. So one of the significant aspects of Dylan's character is his attachment to the reward system at Lumen. So as a reward of his hard work, Dylan is allowed to indulge in occasional luxuries like expensive snack and the status they bring within the corporate hierarchy. And this attachment to external rewards is a reflection of the psychological manipulation, obviously, that the company has over its employees, which, in a way makes Dylan a victim and a product of the company's controlling mechanisms. But Dylan's most important development kind of starts when he questions the company's motives and becomes more active in resisting the oppressive environment. So his turning point is where he starts to observe the other people uncovering the secrets behind the severance procedure, and it's almost like it's just kind of happening out of boredom. Like, he's just kind of interested in anything that could give him a little bit of something outside of this monotonous work. So Dylan's emotional arc kind of moves from this almost nihilistic detachment and boredom to just let's just do this just out of I want to get the fuck out of here, I'm bored. So Dylan's journey kind of highlights the complexities of corporate manipulation and the ways in which individuals can become complicit in their own subjugation, but then also how easy it is to break them out of it, even just for the sake of a little bit of entertainment, a little bit of something, right? A little bit of a more impressive reward. So I want to analyze this character And I want to talk about, the same as before, why he engaged in the revolutionary aspect of what he's doing. So Dylan is, like I said, a pragmatic character. He's focused mostly on securing material rewards for himself within the system, and like his desire for financial gain is probably the most straightforward example of Stirnerian egoism in the show. But the thing that really gets Dylan out of his funk at work is that he realizes that his life isn't just like this nihilistic pit of shit, because he does find out, and this is what gets the whole revolution started, that his Audi has a son. So at first glance, Dylan is this like office clown. He's sarcastic, he's cocky, he's obsessed with perks, he's bored, he's, pretty much just focused on like the reward system. He like thinks about dumb shit like waffle parties, right? So what makes his awakening so Stirnerian, in my opinion, is that Dylan isn't really alienated in the typical Marxist sense. Like, he enjoys the system because it kind of feeds him and it feeds his nihilism. So he's egoistic from the beginning, just in a deeply contained kind of way. And this is also why he kind of breaks the quickest. He's in, he's bored, and now he knows he's got shit going on the outside, so he's down. So his revolutionary moment doesn't come through moral outrage, right? It comes through possession. Like, he understands that there's something that he possesses which exists outside this world, and that knowledge kind of ignites something primal in him. It's not a duty, it's not a sense of sacrifice, it's a like furious kind of realization that something of his has been taken from him, right? So Stirner would see this as the moment that Dylan ceases to be like a tamed ego and kind of becomes like a raging ego. So his rebellion isn't a call for liberation. It's actually deeply personal, and it's a cry of theft, right? His property, what he considers his property, which is not necessarily this person, this son, but this role as a father, right? His experience, his memories that have been taken from him essentially as what he perceives as without his consent. So he's not fighting because it's wrong. He's fighting because it's his, and he feels that they took it from him. So what's striking is that Dylan, who's the most seemingly unserious and childish of the group, kind of becomes the one who takes the biggest risk, right? He does the shit that actually kind of facilitates the other's ability to kind of revolutionize the system. So in Stirnerian terms, Dylan has realized he is owned, right? He's not in control of himself, right? So not in the ideological sense, but literally his body, his mind, his family, his desires are all kind of locked away and regulated by a company that he never consented to. So his violent rebellion is not an act, and he is the one who becomes violent, is not an act of revolution in the traditional sense at all. It's a insurrection of the ego, just like Stirner talks about in The Ego on Its Own, against all that would reduce it to function and number. So Dylan's wrath isn't moral, it's possessive. But now I want to give an example of what I think is the most fascinating quote-unquote bad guy in the show, because his egoism is subtle. It's like it's kind of balanced in a sense. So there's this character, his name is Milchik, and Milchik is one of those characters who doesn't immediately come off as like the big bad guy, but his role is like more like a mid-level manager who's kind of essential to maintaining the oppressive system within Lumen, but he's also kind of there to like put a smile on the worker's face, even though he does it kind of badly. But I think that's obviously like an allegory for like anyone's kind of manager in a workplace, right? So Milchik's role as a helper or assistant in the department kind of positions him as a middle manager within the company's hierarchy, and he has like this calm, almost like paternalistic demeanor at first, which kind of contrasts with the more aggressive or cold personalities of the higher ups, like this woman, I forgot her first name, Mrs. Cobell, I think is her name. But this calmness that Milchik has kind of hides his effectiveness as an enforcer of the company's will, and this is something that comes in the second season. So he kind of takes over in the second season and provides a more kind environment, which is interesting, but I don't have time to talk about that today. So from a Stirnerian perspective, Milchik's actions are not motivated necessarily by a sense of duty to the company or like an abstract sense of morality, but by the self-interest that's embedded in his ego, right? So Milchick's loyalty to the company and to Miss Cobell in particular could be understood as an extension of his egoism. So he takes pleasure in the authority that he wields over the severed workers, and he kind of likes to exercise power in very subtle ways because he feels that this is, potentially manipulating their perceptions and is more successfully controlling their movements within the office. Like he has a very surveillance kind of function. So his interactions with the workers, particularly Helly, Mark, and Irving, kind of reveal his egoistic tendencies in more subtle ways. Like he really seems to enjoy the manipulation of the people that he controls. So for example, he has this interaction with Mark, the protagonist, which kind of reveals his comfort in maintaining an asymmetrical power dynamic. Like he plays a role in controlling access to information and resources, which gives him leverage over the other characters, but he also feigns compassion at the same time when his true motivation is obviously in personal value, which he gets from reinforcing the system and in the enjoyment of manipulating the workers. So I think that Milchick kind of represents a key aspect of egoism that's often overlooked, which is the egoism of complicity. So the character Mrs. Cobell is way more overt in her actions and in her demeanor and behavior, and Milchick is way more passive, and he has a more passive role in the system and doesn't act overtly malevolent, right? His egoism isn't about grandiose power or control, but about maintaining his position within the structure. So by playing the role of the good guy in the workers' eyes, he secures a certain level of respect and influence, which reinforces his personal identity. So Milchick's complicity is actually rooted in his ability to maintain a facade of neutrality while ultimately being just part of the oppressive system. So his role in the narrative is an embodiment of how people remain blind to their own internalized spooks, like loyalty to the company or the idea of duty, while still asserting their own self-interest. So his egoism is disguised by the mask of benevolence, which makes him one of the most insidious figures in the show, in my opinion. Okay, so what have we learned here? I don't know, man. I don't know. I'm just yapping. But while this show, I think, might be a Marxist representation of the concept of alienation, which, to be honest, is kind of really on the nose and obvious. It also very much negates its supposed Marxist position, in my opinion, and very much aligns with Shanna's indirect critique of Marxism by highlighting the individual struggle and stories of the individual characters in a way that shows the significance of acknowledging egoism as as a foundation for all further revolution action. So I thought this would be a perfect time to look at Marx's critique of Stirner from his text Saint Max in the German Ideology, and then let's use Severance to show Marx that he's a fucking dummy. So in Saint Max, Marx critiques Stirner in, pretty nasty ad hominem ways to say the same shit over and over again, which is just a regurgitation of his own philosophy. So it's basically the intellectual equivalent to a group project where Marx insists everyone has to follow the collective vision and Stirner just wants to do his own thing, right? So Marx can't stand Stirner's unapologetic egoism. He's who cares about individual autonomy when we've got class struggle to focus on? And Stirner's all about rejecting the spooks, right? This societal spooks like religion and state and, anything that tells us what to do. So Marx got a little bit of a collective spook going on. So in the German Ideology, specifically the section often referred to as Saint Max, Marx offers a pretty harsh but somewhat repetitive critique of Stirner. Much of it comes across as an ad hominem attack and very sarcastic, because Marx doesn't just aim at Stirner's ideas but also his style and his personality, so it's just really kind of petty. But at its core, the critique kind of boils down to a fundamental philosophical disagreement, which is Marx represents a collectivist vision rooted in material conditions and class struggle, as we all know, and Stirner champions like an unapologetic individualist stance that focuses on personal autonomy and the rejection of ideological control. So Marx is the guy insisting everyone has to commit to the collective goal of overthrowing capitalism, and Stirner is off doing his own thing, and he's saying that it's not going to work unless people feel like they're able to do their own thing. So Marx finds Stirner's focus on the self to be unserious and laughable, and from Marx's perspective, Stirner's kind of too absorbed in his own ego to recognize the real structural force that shapes our life. So like forces like labor exploitation and ownership of the means of production and class dynamics and so forth. So for Marx, the main critique is that he feels that the struggle against capitalism is collective. It has to be collective. It has to be a material battle. But for Stirner, liberation obviously begins with the individual recognizing that these collective causes are themselves ideological spooks, and kind of focusing on the fact that you're your own master and you have autonomy and you have agency, and you don't have to become part of anything to kind of get this revolution going. So ultimately, Marx's views are that Stirner is, a radical individualist and also naive and politically useless, basically. There's actually a quote that I would like to read to you that kind of sums up the way that he feels about Stirner, and it goes like this. The apocalyptic prophet did not prophesy accurately this time. Now at last, after Stirner has acclaimed man, one can state that he ought to have said, "So he carried me into the wilderness of the spirit, and I saw a man sit upon a scarlet-colored beast, full of blasphemy of names. And upon his forehead was a name written, Mystery, the Unique. And I saw the man drunken with the blood of holy, etc. So we now enter the wilderness of the spirit." This is obviously him making fun of the way that Stirner writes, and also, his whole concept. He kind of just feels like it's stupid and ideological even, and idealistic. So let's give Marx a little gut punch by looking at why the employees in Severance actually caused the revolution. So in St. Max, Marx critiques Stirner's egoism as individualistic, right? Feels that it's childish rebellion that misses the point of societal transformation. And Marx sees Stirner's focus on the self as a shallow fantasy because it doesn't engage with class struggle, which Marx views as the real engine for change. But in Severance, we see that the employees' personal struggles for autonomy are the revolution. It's the accumulation of individual personal struggles for autonomy that are driving everything, right? So each worker acts in their own self-interest. In other words, the story in Severance, the individual plots revealed that individual egoism is far from selfish. Okay, it's the beginning of actual change in this case, in this story. So in the show, the characters start with personal goals. Helly wants to get out. She's desperate, okay? Mark is trying to figure out what the hell is going on, okay? Irving, absolutely, horrifically in love with somebody. And each of these struggles begin as a solo fight against the oppressive system, right? But these personal acts of rebellion are what ultimately lead to collective disruption. So this very individualistic struggle embodies Stirner's theory, right? Freedom starts with the self. And everything that comes after that, the result of self-ownership, this isn't something that Stirner's focused on, but it most certainly could potentially free people, okay? Collectively. So let's take a closer look at what unfolds, right? When Helly first arrives at the company, she's not thinking about collective uprising, because she's thinking about her escape. Same with Mark. Mark isn't acting out a grand vision for the company's downfall. He's just trying to make sense of his life, of his dual life, which is driven by his need to deal with trauma and memories. So his struggle is split between his work and personal self, and he wants to challenge the legitimacy of this power structure to figure himself out. And even Milchick, this seemingly more docile enforcer, is acting out of the kind of nature of egoism, right? He's a cog in the system, yes, but his role is motivated by a subtle form of self-interest. His sense of control, his position within the hierarchy, and his ability to assert power over others, this is what he likes. His egoism seems passive, but it's still an essential part of how the system perpetuates itself, right? So every single character in the show, and I could, talk about the other characters too, but is acting out of egoism. So ultimately, Severance kind of demonstrates Jenna's point in a way Marx could never have predicted, right? So the personal freedom, which begins with the ego in this case, is the root of revolutionary change. So the workers don't need a collective ideology or some grand social cause to fight for. They just need to reclaim themselves. And the interesting thing is that Marx didn't really negate this. So his critique of Stirner is actually really silly in a sense, because they're essentially saying the same thing from different perspectives. It's just that Marx thinks that Stirner's focus is going to confuse or essentially screw with people's ability to revolutionize themselves because they are still, caught in selfishness. So to circle back to Marx, maybe it's not so much about the wilderness of the spirit that he mocks, but actually about how personal egoistic struggles for autonomy can actually lead to a more radical transformation than Marx's sort of class-based revolution ever could. So in the end, the revolution in Severance is personal, and that's exactly why it worked. Alright friends, enough about the show. I want to stick though with the topic of cult and collectivism and ideology and how it relates to ownness, so stick around for the next segment where we discuss just that. I thought it would be fascinating to look at another fundamental aspect of spookiness, to then show how Stirner wants to help us by presenting his concept of ownness. And this is kind of relating to the stuff that I talked about in the last episode. So now I want to think on something that we all have been through in our lives, I would assume, and ask the following question. Why do we even need something outside of ourselves at all? So at some point, everybody has felt it, that kind of pull towards something bigger, something beyond the self. So a cause or a belief system or a higher ideal. And for some, it's religion, right? For others, it's like a political movement or a social movement, a community, a personal brand, or even a company culture. But the question I want to ask is why? Why do we feel the need to attach ourselves to something external at all? Why do we feel we need something that gives us direction or structure or even meaning? So psychologically, there's an obvious comfort in certainty, right? The world is chaotic, and the self, if you really pay attention to it, is full of contradictions. So we're unpredictable, we're inconsistent, we're vulnerable, and to kind of embrace that fully is absolutely terrifying. So we look for something stable, something that feels stable that we can hold on to. Obviously, Freud and Lacan at this point would point to the split subject or the fragmentation of the psyche. But for today's episode, I want to look at a more kind of fringe concept, which Freud talks about, which I always found really interesting because it relates to cult and ideology. So in his book, Civilization and Its Discontents, he very briefly mentions the concept of the oceanic feeling. He later kind of engages more with this in his book, The Future of Illusion. Anyway, so Freud's concept of the oceanic feeling is all about that deep, boundless sense of oneness that he believes leads people to a sensual experience, which most people confuse as spiritual, which kind of gets them caught up in religion or cult or ideology. So he suggests that this embrace of this feeling is due to part of us never wanting to let go of the early childhood state where we felt no separation from the world around us. So we kind of long to return to that unity, even if it means dissolving into an ideology or a leader or a higher cause. But let's look at philosophical interpretations also of this feeling of needing some higher power in our lives. So philosophically, many thinkers have addressed this, especially in that humans are drawn to collectivism and ideology, right? So from a social contract perspective, Rousseau saw the collective as a necessary safeguard against the chaos of individualism. He kind of argued that people need to surrender certain freedoms and are willing to conform to like a common will or like a general will to ensure the functioning of society. Like this is their agenda. And in his view, this collective structure kind of helps prevent the disintegration of society into self-serving individuals. Then we have Max Weber also, who kind of tackled this in looking at ideology and social life, particularly in terms of bureaucracy and like rationalization. So he suggested that modern society shift toward bureaucratic systems and the increasing emphasis on efficiency, which is what he called the iron cage of rationalization, led to a kind of ideological imprisonment, right? So people become trapped within systems that promise order and progress, but ultimately stifle individuality and creativity. Then we have existentialists like Sartre and Heidegger, who saw the search for structure as a form of bad faith. So Sartre argued that people often escape the burden of true freedom by hiding behind roles. So essentially what they were doing is they were using this as an escape from responsibility. So for Sartre, collectivism and ideologies are like mechanisms to avoid confronting the terrifying responsibility of creating one's own essence. And this is similar to Heidegger, who kind of suggested that human beings are often drawn to social norms and ideologies as a way to escape the anxiety of confronting their own, finite existence and like the ambiguity of their existence as well. Then we have Nietzsche, who I think probably is the most interesting here, who saw the appeal of external ideologies as a symptom of what he called slave morality, where the weak or oppressed turn to collective ideals to affirm their existence. And in this view, ideologies like Christianity and socialism were forms of life-denying doctrines that sought to impose limitations on individual strength and creativity and like self-overcoming. So Nietzsche famously proclaimed that God is dead, right? We all know this. And by doing that, he suggested that the structures that once gave meaning to life had sort of collapsed, right? So this left a void that people scrambled to fill with new ideologies, which often, happened out of fear of confronting essentially meaninglessness. And then, of course, we have Stirner, who, obviously takes this critique even further, even though it was before Nietzsche. But so he sees all higher ideals like God or society or even the state as just spooky bullshit. Projections of like alienated human desires that enslave individuals to abstract concepts. So for Stirner, the human need for ideology or external systems isn't just a form of like self-deception, but it's also a means of control, and one that keeps people from embracing their uniqueness. So this concept of ownness rejects the spooks, that exist in this in favor of radical individual freedom, where the self is the center of meaning and power, right? So first of all, I want to say that I think it's crazy how much of a forerunner Stirner was to so many philosophies that followed and how little credit he actually got for this. Anyways, so what I want to do now is to show how Stirner interprets the need for spooks and how he proposes we can work towards self-ownership by looking at his critique of Christianity and then Feuerbach's absolute bullshit. So Stirner's critique of Christianity and, religion more broadly cuts to the core of what he views as the ultimate ideological spook. Okay, he talks about this like a lot in his book. So for Stirner, religion is the quintessential example of how humans become bound to these abstract ideals that he has beef with. So Christianity in particular creates this like all-encompassing system of ideals by offering a transcendental God and a divine law that governs the moral and existential lives of individuals. So these ideals become so internalized, so ingrained in society that they eclipse the individual's autonomy altogether, and they lead them to defer their will and identity to an external authority. So the idea of a higher power makes humans subordinate and constrain their freedom and self-expression. But he also critiques what came after all of that. Okay, so because, at some point people started getting sus of this shit, and so people like Feuerbach came along and were like, nah, see, it's not God, it's humanity. Right, it's humanity. So let's look at that. Feuerbach was like the predecessor or a predecessor of Stirner, who saw religion as kind of humanity's projection of its own essence, right? So for Feuerbach, God isn't separate or like a mystical entity, but rather like a reflection of humanity's own desires and ideals. And religion is then humanity's way of distancing itself from its own nature in a sense. But Stirner was particularly irritated by this, okay? He was really pissed off about this. So let me read you a quote from The Ego in its Own. To the ancients, the world was truth, but he forgets to make the important addition. A truth whose untruth they tried to back off, and at last really did. What is meant by those words of Feuerbach will be easily recognized if they are put alongside the Christian thesis of the quote-unquote vanity and transitoriness of the world. For as the Christian can never convince himself of the vanity of the divine word, but believes in its eternal and unshakable truth, which the more its depths are searched, must all the more brilliantly come to light and triumph. So the ancients on their side lived in the feeling that the world and mundane relations, like the natural ties of blood, were the truth before which their powerless, quote-unquote, I must bow. The very thing on which the ancients set the highest value is spurned by Christians as the valueless, and what they recognized as truth these brand as idle lies. The high significance of the fatherland disappears, and the Christian must regard himself as quote-unquote a stranger on earth. The sanctity of funeral rites, from which sprang a work of, is designated as a paltry thing. Let the dead bury their dead. The infrangible truth of family ties is represented as an untruth which one cannot promptly enough get clear of, and so in everything. So this is kind of a complicated quote, but so here he kind of critiques Feuerbach's view of truth, right? Specifically his understanding of the ancient world. So Feuerbach claims that the ancients saw the world as truth, but Stirner points out that Feuerbach misses an important nuance, right? The ancients, despite regarding the world as true, were aware of its inherent untruth and kind of tried to transcend it. So Stirner compares this to the Christian rejection of worldly values. Just as Christians view the world's transitory nature as an illusion, the ancients, in their own way, saw beyond their immediate social and natural realities, like family ties and national pride, as truth to something more profound. But Christians dismiss these truths as meaningless, with concepts like family and homeland reduced to like mere illusions, right? So Stirner highlights this shift in perspective by illustrating how both Christianity and Feuerbach fail to acknowledge the dynamic and the transcendent potential of human egoism beyond societal constructs. Then he goes on to critique Feuerbach's theological view by focusing on the relationship between human essence and the concept of spirit or God. So Feuerbach argues that humanity mistakenly placed its essence in the external figure of God, and now in recognizing this error, humanity should reclaim its essence and move it from the divine realm to the human realm. So this obviously really irritates Stirner. So Stirner rejects this by emphasizing that the notion of essence itself, right, remains separate from the individual. So he points out that even if we recognize God as our essence, it doesn't resolve the contradiction of having an essential and unessential self, which splits the individual from their own true being. So then Stirner goes further to critique like the very act of drawing God into the human sphere. He views Feuerbach's efforts as a kind of desperate attempt to bring the divine into earthly realms, and like this is like the result of a craving for the otherworldly to be experienced in the here and now. So this for Stirner doesn't resolve the alienation of the individual at all. It just substitutes one form of external authority, which is God, for another, which is the concept of human essence. So, in summary, Stirner kind of rejects Feuerbach's attempts to reconcile human essence with divinity and insists that both the concept of God and man's essence are alienated from the individual, from the true unique self. So Stirner's critique kind of exposes Feuerbach's theological liberation as ultimately manipulation or, simply inadequate. So now I want to kind of circle back to Freud's oceanic feeling, because I think it relates to Stirner's approach to religion. Okay, so both perspectives deal with a sense of alienation from the self, albeit in different contexts. So Freud's oceanic feeling refers to a feeling of oneness with like the universe, which is obviously fake. It's like a perceived sense of dissolving boundaries between self and other, which he sees as like primitive, regressive, desire-based emotional responses to return to a feeling which he suggests can be seen as an illusion, right? Which is like a temporary escape from the reality of the separate self. And in a sense, Stirner similarly critiques the concept of a transcendent essence, whether it's God, human essence, or like a spirit of some kind that's external to the individual. So he argues that any attempt to merge or identify with this external essence, whether it's through religion or humanism or whatever, results in a sense of self-alienation actually, and a failure to fully recognize the individual's autonomy. So both Stirner and Freud see these experiences as attempts to overcome the isolation of the individual, and they both highlight that such efforts are ultimately self-deceptive. So while Freud's oceanic feeling kind of represents a regressive yearning for unity, Stirner's critique of Feuerbach shows us that he kind of rejects external ideals that distort the individual's autonomy. But essentially, this is the same kind of thing that they're referring to. So all this in the back of our minds, let's look at Stirner's concept of ownness and how it presents as, in my opinion, like an antidote to all of this. So in Stirner's The Ego in Its Own, he says, "Ownness includes in itself everything own, and brings to honor again what Christian language dishonored. But ownness has not any alien standard either, as it is not in any sense an idea like freedom, morality, humanity, etc. It is only a description of the owner." So this quote is important. This is where Stirner offers a seriously radical departure from all of the externalized ideals that dominate religious, moral, or philosophical discourse. So where Christianity puts truth and spirit outside of the individual, and where Feuerbach attempts to reclaim the divine essence but still separates it from the individual, Stirner's concept of ownness insists that the individual is the sole arbiter of their own being. So ownness is not a value or an ideal to be imposed from outside, but it's a self-description of the individual who has fully claimed their autonomy. So it's not a moral concept, it's not a transcendent idea like freedom or humanity, it's an embodied act of self-possession or repossession, right? An affirmation of the individual's right to define and shape their existence without any external standard or higher authority. So in terms of Freud's concept of the oceanic feeling, which kind of offers this, fascinating comparison, let's look at how they relate. So Freud's oceanic feeling refers to this emotional sensation, right, of boundless unity with the universe, or like a sense of being dissolved into something greater than oneself. And he saw this feeling as an expression of like a regressive longing for a return to the like undifferentiated state of infancy in the womb. Okay, you can think whatever you want about that, but in terms of like feeling, it kind of makes sense. So the oceanic feeling, as Freud suggests, kind of arises from a desire to transcend the limitations of the individual ego, which can often be found, I would say, in religion or mystical experience or spiritual experiences. But according to Freud, this feeling is bullshit. It's a longing for a state of non-separation that's ultimately incompatible with the reality of the individual's selfhood, right? So Stirner's ownness can be seen as kind of an antidote to this illusion, right? Because Stirner wants us to focus on bullshit. He wants us to think about the shit that's not real. So instead of seeking unity with an external divine essence or like a mystical sense of oneness, Stirner's ownness is kind of like the affirmation of the self as a fully autonomous and, self-defined, like lone being, right? So it rejects the idea that the self has to merge with something, right? Anything. So it kind of gives us a way to identify this oceanic feeling as essentially bullshit. So in this way, Stirner's ownness is a concept that serves as a spook buster, right? It serves as a radical antidote to this like longing feeling, to this emotional escapism. So it demands that the individual has to abandon the false dichotomies of inner and outer, self and other, and, really just embrace the most like direct and unmediated relationship with their own existence. And, this is what's considered self-ownership. So this self-possession, which is free of any ideals, becomes this powerful tool for the individual to reshape their life and the world around them and kind of avoid this escapism altogether. So what does it mean in practice? Let's look at Spook, that probably most people can kind of relate to, kind of also circling back to Severance. So I want to think about the spook of corporate ideology, or like the cult of productivity. So in modern work culture, especially in realms of tech, as I have noticed lately, and probably also like finance and stuff, there's a really pervasive cult of productivity, right? So this manifests as like the constant drive to optimize every part of your life, makes you turn your personal identity into a project to be like optimized for profit and efficiency and productivity and all that bullshit. So this kind of mirrors this, oceanic feeling. So there's a promise of fulfillment, and it's dependent on conformity to productivity ideologies. Like this is almost like an addiction. It's like chasing the ultimate like result of this effort, which kind of is that oceanic feeling. So let's look at it through a Stirnerian lens. So just like religion or other ideologies, this productivity cult alienates individuals from their desires and experiences. So people become tools of the system instead of masters of their own life. And they internalize the need to be constantly busy and efficient to be able to get to this point of relief, right? This point of connection. Even though in their efforts, they're disconnecting themselves more and more from the actual, they're alienating themselves from their own work and their own efforts. So how can ownness help, and how do you even go about it? Well, I think the antidote is literally rejecting the need for external validation altogether by recognizing this as nothing more than an oceanic feeling that you're chasing, right? You're basically an addict. And then thinking in Freudian and Stirnerian terms about why we need this shit in the first place. So because the truth is, the spook of productivity, like the oceanic feeling, is rooted in a deep-seated fear of separateness and self-doubt. So the drive to optimize everything and the need to be constantly productive comes from a fear of insignificance. So it's a way to validate our existence through external measures and this hope of a future where you feel relief and where you feel connection, and you're willing to disconnect further and further from everything around you to focus on that goal. And this goes for other things like political ideology, social movements, any form of worship. But to look at it in another way, this is not like a total call to abandon all responsibility or productivity, right? So Stirner's philosophy doesn't advocate for like idleness altogether, but it's more like a way to approach these things on our own terms and with our own self-possession. So rather than chasing hollow external measures of success, we should focus on what actually fulfills us individually. So productivity should be reclaimed, right? It should be a tool for our own growth, like in the way that we want, and not an external force that dictates how we live. And this is why this oceanic feeling thing is so helpful, because it's a way to determine, hey, am I just kind of looking for a high right now? Or, am I actually doing something reasonable? All right, friends, I think it's time we move on to the next segment, where I want to show you a book that I found recently, which I would like to present to you. So let's go. Alright, so the book that I want to make you aware of is called Max Stirner and the Political Theology of Fanaticism, and it's by Janssen. I think that's how you say it. And it was published in 2024, so it's kind of brand new. So overall, the book explores Stirner's critique of political theology by looking at his deconstruction of modern atheism, secularism, Hegelian idealism, and Feuerbachian humanism, all of which he kind of sees as forms of political theology, right? I kind of talked about that before. So basically, the author claims that Stirner's focus on the psychological and phenomenological aspects of political theology emerges from philosophical desires that are rooted in religion. So the first chapter, after, a chapter dedicated to discussing the approach and background and purpose of the book, looks pretty intensely at Stirner's perspective on political theology by focusing on his critique of modern atheism. So it examines his rejection of Hegelian idealism and also, Feuerbach's bullshit humanism, both of which he considers forms of political theology. So the author claims that while Stirner acknowledges the historical evolution of political theology, he places actually much more of an importance on its psychological and phenomenological dimensions. So in essence, he kind of shows that Stirner demonstrates that political theology kind of comes from a shift toward religion in order to satisfy specific philosophical needs or psychological needs. Okay, then the next chapter, the author compares Stirner's approach to political theology with that of Carl Schmitt, who was also a critic of Christianity and liberalism, but had kind of differing views on the interaction between religion, politics, the sacred, and the secular. So basically he says that Schmitt uses political theology to support state sovereignty, while Stirner undermines the legitimacy of political concepts and institutions, right? Then in the next chapter he talks about Stirner being very unique in his critique of liberalism as a form of political theology because he focused on its abstract notions of freedom that sacrifices individual liberty, and this is one of the only works where this is done. And then finally in chapter 5 he presents Stirner's philosophy of egoism, which rejects obviously metaphysical structures and advocates for pragmatic self-determination, according to the author. So basically he claims that Stirner's egoism, rather than promoting a revolution, actually calls for a revolt against existing orders without a prescribed alternative, although the chapter also questions whether Stirner truly manages to transcend political theology by using divine language in his description of the Egoist. So what I like about the book is that it really deeply focuses on why and how Stirner's approach is unique, in that he critiques both religious and secular systems and argues that political authority, like religious authority, stems from abstract metaphysical concepts. So what Stirner does, according to the author, is he challenges these spooks by straight up seeing them as forms of external authority that undermine individual freedom. So in a way, Stirner's perspective of religion itself extends beyond religious critique to kind of include political critique, and this is very unique. The contrast with Schmitt is also interesting because Schmitt, in his approach to political theology, really emphasizes the necessity of establishing a sovereign authority to provide structure in a world devoid of metaphysical certainties, which is kind of the common narrative in a sense. And he kind of advocates for an arbitrary sovereign decision that sort of draws from monotheistic ideas of creation from nothing. But Stirner, as he tends to do, rejects this need for authority, and he argues that individuals shouldn't live that way and that they should live without relying, or should is a bad word for Stirner, but you know what I mean, that it might be better to rely on oneself rather than external structures. So in a way, both recognize the existential crisis caused by the lack of objective structure, but their responses are drastically different. And Stirner's is obviously very unique. The thing that I like the most, which is also what I talked about earlier, referring to Freud's stuff, is that it highlights the psychological aspects of Stirner's critique, right? So this is interesting because it shows that Stirner kind of locates the origin of political theology in the faith and commitment of the individual on a psychological level. Okay, so he argues that political authority isn't a product of social or historical forces, but something that arises from the subjective engagement of the individual with abstract ideals. So this is psychological, right? This is a psychological approach that is very unique because it kind of broadens the scope of political theology by incorporating a phenomenological perspective that examines the individual's inner engagement with ideals and then looks at how that shapes political authority. In the conclusion of the book, the author outlines all his arguments and findings regarding this analysis, and he basically says that Stirner argues that political fanaticism is not just a trait of specific political movements, but actually a much deeper philosophical and psychological phenomenon which is embedded within individuals, right? So it stems from a psychological need to attach oneself with higher ideals, just like I talked about before. And this attachment isn't unique to traditional religion. It actually extends to all ideologies, including in this case liberalism. So Stirner critiques the liberal ideal of value-free systems and asserts that it can never really accommodate the inherent fanaticism in human psychology. Okay, so this is so important for everything that I am doing too in my own research. So such systems kind of inevitably reproduce forms of fanaticism because they can't fulfill the deeper psychological need for metaphysical security. So Stirner contends that political solutions, no matter how liberal or progressive, will always be insufficient to resolve fanaticism because they are based on the same psychosocial mechanisms that give rise to it. So he proposes a shift in the individual's mindset as the only viable way to transcend political fanaticism. So his philosophy of egoism kind of advocates for personal development and self-mastery and autonomy to get people to disengage from political and religious ideologies that offer false promises of security. So basically the idea is to give up on the sense of security altogether, right? So Stirner believes that individuals can weaken their attachment to political institutions not through revolutionary rejection, but through a process of insurrection or disidentification, right? Detachment. And yeah, this is something that I really like about this text. I really think you should read it. It's very interesting and it very much fits with a lot of the stuff that I tend to think about when it comes to Stirner. So this was a really fascinating read. All right, friends, so this is it. This is the end. I won't be able to post an episode next week because I'm going to go to my little brother's show and just kind of going to take a weekend off. I hope you're cool with that. And if you're not, then eat shit because I don't care. Anyways, check him out if you understand German. His name's Duzoe, Duzoe. Oh yeah, and then I want to discuss briefly that I am now officially looking for funding for this entire project, which includes now a podcast that you just listened to and various other ventures like the e-zine, the newsletter, the YouTube channel, and the library that we're building, and much more. So basically what I'm trying to do here with this project is use this kind of recent wave of interest in Stirner to focus on his relevance to contemporary society and create a kind of media hub for all things Stirner, which can help people who are legitimately interested in engaging with his work. So I just want to tell you a little bit about the project because I think you might find it interesting. So I have decided to call it the Unspooked Project. You can find the link in the description. So the Unspooked Project is a multimedia initiative which is dedicated to fostering engagement with the philosophy of Max Stirner. It aims to create a central hub for Stirnerian thought by providing accessible resources, a dedicated library, and spaces for discussion and collaboration. Yes, I just read you the shit that I wrote for the project proposal. The core components of the goals of this project are to have a Stirner-focused digital library. I think that'd be really cool. This could host all available works, translations, critiques, and all related materials. I think that'd be super interesting for everybody who's into that. into his work, because it's kind of, scattered all over the internet, and it'd be nice to have like one space where you can access all of it. Then also the second goal is to have a multimedia platform, which I want to call Unspooked Media, which produces things like an e-zine, a YouTube channel, videos, documentaries, who knows, books, whatever. Then I also kind of envision things like conferences, which can kind of start online, but maybe they could develop into something more, maybe study or writing groups, something like that. And just to have like a sustainable ecosystem that kind of promotes the content creation in this realm, because that is how you get shit out there nowadays. So yeah, the project started out as my Recurring Paradox YouTube channel and newsletter, and we have accumulated some funds so far. Like, we have 17 members altogether across various projects. We have our recent monetization on YouTube and Google AdSense revenue. It's still growing, of course, but yeah, that's where we are right now. Yeah, so we're kind of looking to expand in a sense. So if you would like to support the project in whatever way you can, have a look at the link in the description, check it out, share it. Sharing is great. Comment, subscribe, all that to drive engagement. Anyways, thank you all for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful 2 weeks. See you after my break, and remember not to let the spooks get you.